Good morning, everyone on the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today is the day before an auspicious day here in Barbados, where I'm broadcasting to you from. Tomorrow's Independence Day in Barbados. And so we're in pretty much of a good spirit, and it will lead us into the Christmas season very nicely. So today we're having an interesting discussion around institutions. Now, I am of the view that institutions are fundamentally the most important thing underpinning our country's well-being and development prospects. And so this book that the IDB has published, Nurturing Institutions for a Resilient Caribbean, this is the book that we're going to discuss today. And I feel that this is a book that everyone, if possible, if they can get their hands on it at the local IDB office in the Caribbean, please do so. And I feel that institutions are such a fundamental part of defining our future that I felt compelled to have this discussion. And so I'm very grateful to the IDB for again cooperating and participating in our webinars to bring the content of their research and all of the hard work that they do to you, and to give you the opportunity to ask questions and engage directly with them. So I'm very, very happy to have this webinar this morning. So I want to introduce and thank my fellow panelists and my guests here this morning. First, Moises Short. He is the Regional Economic Advisor for the Caribbean. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
I have Juan Pedro Smith, the Lead Economist, Caribbean Country Department at the IDB. Welcome, Juan Pedro.
Hi, thank you very much. Good morning.
I have Dieter Bauermann. He is the Senior Economist in the Caribbean Country Department at the IDB. Welcome, Dieter.
Thank you. Good morning.
And so I will go straight into the questions as we had outlined in the e-blast that went out for this webinar. And the first and most fundamental one, what exactly are institutions and why do they matter? I believe they do, and I'm already convinced. Tell our audience members, please, what exactly are institutions and why do they matter? All three of you or any of you who wish to respond.
Sure, perhaps I will take this one. Well, good morning, Marla. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar. So we produced this book emphasizing institutions for the Caribbean. So institutions basically will refer to the rules of the game in a society. And those rules could be formal rules enshrined in regulations, in laws, or could also be informal institutions. The idea of institutions is that they give some certainty about the interaction of economic agents, how people interact in a society. So you would expect someone to react to what you are doing. So once you have this kind of framework of how individuals or the government interacts with individuals and citizens and entrepreneurs and so on and so forth, so you create a little bit more of credibility. So that's basically the idea of institutions. So we have institutions in every segment of our daily life. So we have political institutions, we have health institutions that take care of people in terms of health, education, for schooling. We have institutions that regulate economic activity. So as long as you understand the rules of the game, the way people interact, what one can expect from the other agent, so that provides some certainty for economic agents and for citizens in general. Now, the book emphasizes growth, development, reduction of poverty, long-term development, basically. So every country has their own problems. In the short term, we tend to focus quite a lot on what's immediate. This is a little bit more for the medium term. So it's more of a medium term, longer term horizon. So the idea is to say, well, what needs to be done to put the house in order, to have more resilient economies to shocks, to be better prepared to unexpected circumstances, events that might happen that would strengthen and solidify the way these economies are constructed. So the idea is basically once you have those institutions in place and you are kind of a little bit more solidified in that regard, so you are better prepared to face the future, and the prospects for growth and development are higher. So this is something that has been solved in economic theory many years ago, and there is a lot of empirical evidence and literature and economic models that point to this idea of having strong institutions to better prepare you for the future and to better position an economy for growth and development in the medium and term horizon. So this is an idea to keep in mind as you move along, to have it in place, and once you have it in place, solid institutions would set the pace for less poverty, better educated people, healthy people in the economy, and so on and so forth. That's kind of basically the main idea.
Agreed. Do Juan Pedro or Dita, either of you wanted to add to that?
Yes, perhaps. And maybe after Moises' definition of what we refer to is what we refer for institutions, right? Which are the rules of the games, rules of the game that regulate the life in society. Then what we go in the book about is precisely identifying those institutions that have been shown to be relatively more important as a determinant for economic growth and development, right? So, and this evidence is global evidence, not only centered in the Caribbean, right? So looking at the global evidence, we identify in the first part of the book those institutions that should be there in order to provide a more sustainable growth path, right? And that evidence has shown these to be key institutions. And basically, these are grouped in 4 sets of institutions, right? The first one would be the political institutions. Second, institutions related to the rule of law. Third, institutions related to the development of human capital, with a special focus on education and health. And 4, institutions that regulate economic activity, with a special focus on fiscal institutions and monetary institutions. So, in a nutshell, this is the 4 areas where the evidence has been shown to have identified key institutions, and that is what we do in the first part of the book. And then after identifying key institutions, we look at how these institutions are in the Caribbean, specifically for the 6 Caribbean countries where we focus on, right? And the book focuses on the 6 Caribbean countries that are members of the IDB Caribbean Country Department, namely the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago.
Right, and so that leads me nicely into the second question I was going to ask, which is, what exactly is the status of our institutions in the Caribbean? Now, I know amongst these 6 countries, there will be some countries where they are stronger than the others. If you can give us your take on that, and where they are weak and where they are strong, let us know.
We divided the sample. Well, we do the analysis for every single country of the 6 countries that Peter mentioned, but one can also divide the sample into 2 subsamples, small subsamples of 3 countries each. One of the subsamples is countries that are dependent on a specific commodity. So those countries are Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. And the other subsample is conformed of those countries that do not depend on a commodity. So those are Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas. Now, in general, and this is not only for the Caribbean, what we have found, and this is a result that you would see in other regions of the world, and it comes a little bit as a surprise. Once you think about it, it's not so much of a surprise, but it comes a little bit as a surprise, is that once you have a very specific commodity that the countries really depend on, most of the indicators for the strength of institutions turn out to be relatively worse in comparison to the countries that do not have a specific commodity. So if you think a little bit about it, so you would say, well, if you have oil or a very important resource that could generate a lot of wealth in the future, that's when you need to have stronger institutions. For society to be aware how these proceeds are managed, and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
So in general, those type of indicators do not turn out to be as positive for commodity-dependent economies as it is for non-commodity dependent economies. Now, another interesting finding that we have is that the 6 Caribbean countries are relatively strong in terms of their political institutions. There is significant and positive trust in the political system. So these are open democracies, transparent democracies, pluralistic democracies, and people actually trust these institutions. And actually, you would see some of the results in the book. Some of the rankings for these 6 countries are comparable to what you would say the gold standard in other regions of the world, other countries that have advanced significantly in terms of political transparency, OECD countries, and so on and so forth. So in that regard, I believe that the Caribbean has a very strong point of departure because the political institutions are perhaps one of the most important ones. If you trust the political system and you have an electoral system that is trusted and people understand it and accept the results, so that's a very positive development. Once you have that, you can evolve and try to develop other institutions that perhaps are not as developed as political institutions. So this is a very good finding for the 6 Caribbean countries and something that I guess the region should be proud of, but that doesn't mean that there is a lot of work to be done in other areas. So in other areas that we take a look at, development areas such as human capital formation in terms of education and health, there is some work to be done, and more specifically on economic institutions. So economic institutions, we feel in general for the Caribbean, there is some way to go.
Either Dieter, Juan Pedro, either of you want to add to that?
Well, from a regional perspective, as you mentioned, also Moises has started to brief a little bit. Although we analyze all of the countries, we do find some similarities and then other disparities, right? So in terms of similarities, Moises has mentioned the positive similarity that in general there is good trust in the political system. Another good aspect that is more or less common to all countries is also the trust in the justice system, right? Which is rule of law, right? Trust in justice system and corruption perceptions within the judicial system and are very good. So basically are almost comparable with the OECD standards, right? In terms of that trust. What maybe lacks a little bit is about the timeliness of justice administration. So people trust the system, there is low incidence of corruption, but the timeliness is not as satisfactory. And when you look the hard evidence about, for example, an indicator of the density of judges per 100,000 population, then you really can observe that the density of judges across the Caribbean countries is well below the world average and other comparable regions. So it's a trusted justice system, but the timeliness of justice administration could be improved, not only by increasing the density of judges, which is also below what you would expect given the level of development of the country, but also improving the way in which justice is administered by introducing, for example, innovation in terms of exploiting information and communication technologies, digitalization of the economies, and these kind of tools that are now available and that could provide a significant leapfrog, from a technological standpoint to the justice administration.
So, um, right. So, I mean, with respect to the strength of the institutions in the Caribbean, there are some cases where we are comparable to, as you say, OECD countries. But the two things I want to highlight is I know that we probably don't have a good enough comparison for all the metrics from a post-independence time 52 years ago, as in the case of Barbados, till now. But there is a general sense that some institutional weakening has taken place in some of these jurisdictions in the post-independence period. So weakening of existing institutions, but also the fact that perhaps institutions needed to evolve to keep up with changing way we do business, changes in society, and so on. And perhaps that evolution is lacking in some areas. So I want to talk a little bit about that, about the Caribbean, about where institutions have weakened, why have they weakened, or not remained relevant. And in particular, maybe if we can discuss the situation of Guyana, because you mentioned your separation between commodity dependent versus non-commodity dependent, and the fact that when institutions are found to be weaker in commodity dependent countries, which of course is not unique to the Caribbean. It's a chicken and egg? I don't know which one comes first. Does the commodity boom come first and then weaker institutions come after, or is it the other way around? And in Guyana, it is of particular relevance now, institutional strength, that is, because of the kind of windfall that Guyana is expected to get in the coming year or two when they begin to produce crude oil in pretty significant quantities. So can we discuss that? How and where have institutions seem to have weakened in the Caribbean, and any reference to Guyana that you can share?
Sure. Well, I wouldn't say that institutions have deteriorated or weakened. I would say perhaps that not much attention has been placed on the development of some of the institutions or to strengthen some of the institutions that are already in place. That's specifically the case for economic institutions all over the Caribbean, and I'll get to Guyana in a second. Let us take, for example, fiscal responsibility laws, central bank transparency, central bank independence. If you take a look at Latin America, most of the region in Latin America, in the early 1990s, started to take a look at these issues. So now you take a look at Latin America and you would see a whole variety of fiscal rules all over the place. Some very strict, some not so strict, some on debt, some on expenditure, and so on and so forth. The same has happened with the way central banks implement monetary policy. Transparency, it's in general all over Latin America. Laws have been amended, more transparency, the way monetary policy is implemented, independence to central banks, and so on and so forth. So for reasons that it's difficult for us really to understand, the Caribbean has remained kind of out of this discussion. So while the rest of the region, Latin America specifically, has moved in a particular direction that has made economic policy more credible in general, the Caribbean has not been part of this. So that is why we place a lot of emphasis on economic institutions in the book. And this is something that should be a significant, there should be a significant effort on the part of economic authorities in the region. Now, going a little bit to Guyana, this is related to what you asked and what I was just mentioning. So Guyana, it's about to transform its economy totally. So this is transformational, the amount of resources they are going to have in a couple of years, the rates of growth they are going to experience. It's totally transformational. Now, we have seen type of situations all over the world in the past. Countries that have succeeded in managing these resources and those resources actually to be reflected in reductions in poverty, economic growth, but not only economic growth, sustainable economic growth, in order to reduce poverty levels and unemployment. So are countries that have established strong institutions. So now Guyana is in the midst of preparing regulations, having a sovereign wealth fund, more transparency in the way fiscal policy is implemented, and so on and so forth. So this is extremely important because now, in about 2 years, Guyana is going to start seeing all these profits. So there has to be a lot of trust how these resources are being managed, how these resources are invested, how much is saved for future generations, how much is spent in different government activities, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So a lot of clarity needs to take place, and we understand that the authorities in Guyana are taking this very seriously, and there is a draft law that will take care of the sovereign wealth fund and so on and so forth, and they still have a little bit of time to get prepared. But the most important thing is to keep in mind that this is transformational. And the best way to face such a positive shock, and just for this positive shock to remain positive, is to have very strong institutions.
I agree. I could not agree with you more, and I know that they're aware of that.
And perhaps,
yes,
I want to mention something about your question that also was embedded in your previous question about what is the chicken and egg problem, right? What
exactly.
comes first, institutions or development or institutions, right? And how has this reflected in the evolution of institutions over time, right? So as you might notice, institutions are not something that just appeared today, right? Institutions have evolved over time, and they're usually sticky. They are reflected in laws, in constitution, in several aspects of the economy. So the appearance or the structure of current institutions has a lot to do with historical experiences. So the book includes an analysis of this, specifically applied to the Caribbean, but it has been shown rigorously already for everywhere in the world, right? And it has to do a lot with the type of colony that each country experiences. For example, there is a differentiation between extractive colonies and settler colonies, right? So extractive colonies were those colonies where colonizers came, but they didn't want to establish themselves there. They just came with the objective of extract the commodity or whatever natural resources were available, and then ship them back to the colonies, and that's it. So when that happened, basically the rules or institutions that these colonizers established there were with that objective, just to go to extract as much as they could, to exploit as much labor as they could, and ship them back to the original country, but not with the idea of bringing their families or establishing there, right? By contrast, there are other type of colonies called like the settlers colonies, right? Where actually colonizers came and because the weather was appropriate or they came with their families, then they came to settle here, and therefore they established institutions in order to protect their property rights, in order to develop, better human capital, etc. And those institutions, that establishment, the initial establishment of institutions, you can see how they have evolved over time, and current institutions reflect that type of reality, trace back. And and it has been shown everywhere in the world, but in particular, we also show in the book how within these 6 Caribbeans, the colonization experiences have differed a lot. And in particular, countries that rely on commodity actually were more like extractive colonies, where institutions have evolved over time over that initial establishment of this type of institutions, versus the other type of colonies where they're more alike or like settlers colonies, right? And also that trigger a lot of other issues. For example, the availability of labor, right? In institutions like in countries like Guyana, Suriname, there's a mix of racial of ethnicities. There are different ethnicities because basically colonizers secure labor inputs across time from different parts, right? From Africa, from India, etc. So you couldn't have an ethnic mix that have also been reflected into politics, right? So there are political parties associated with some ethnicity or with others, right? As opposed to economies like, for example, Barbados or Jamaica, where basically you have one dominant ethnicity, right, the Afro-descendants, and there's not such a mix. So all of these issues that have to do with historical realities are reflected into initial institutions and how they have evolved over time. And we provide this analysis also in the book, showing how these current institutions trace back to the reality of the colonial experiences, right? So it's not something that just appeared today. So it's something that has evolved over time and has a lot to do with history and colonization experience.
Maybe I can add here something from writing
Yes,
the country
please.
chapters. From writing the country chapters, I was involved in two, Barbados and Jamaica. And just to confirm, more than basically the deterioration, which also probably for us would have been very hard to show, because I mean it would take a very deep digging into the literature to really see the deterioration. But what we certainly can see easily is that it was really a standstill. And if you're running a race and you're standing still, then you're going to lose. And I think that's really what happened in the Caribbean. And the other thing is also from the title, it's called Nurturing. I mean, some of them really need a lot of investment. Before there was the number of judges was, for instance, mentioned, and how long or how slow the legal system can be. That's, for instance, very unfortunate because it's very expensive. So this is not an easy institution to fix. That's something that needs a lot of investment, technology at the beginning, all those things. So it was really, and you probably see it even more in a case like Barbados, that had very strong institutions, but then somehow it stopped. It didn't nurture them, and it's very easy then to basically lose the race because you're standing still.
So yeah, and that leads very nicely into the last question that I had with respect to, what do we need to do now? We have some institutions that are strong, as you mentioned, in terms of political institutions, but we have some that have lagged for lack of investment, lack of nurturing. Can you give us an example of where we got it right in the Caribbean, which countries have done what to strengthen and nurture their institutions? What has the outcome looked like? What are the solutions? What do we need to do now?
Well, each country is different and the challenges are different. Now, we have specific chapters for each and every one of those countries, and we try to depict the economic situation, the political, and so on and so forth, and there are some recommendations. So it's a little bit difficult to say for every country how policy needs to evolve. So in general, as I mentioned before, political institutions, rule of law institutions are relatively strong in the six Caribbean countries that we analyze, and of course there are some differences. Dieter mentioned the historical perspective, and this is something that it's a given. So this is something that is nothing one can do. But it's important to realize how those institutions were developed in the first place, and for people to be aware of the challenges and how to move forward. So history is a given. It doesn't mean that one needs to stay put with whatever institutions you have. So if there is a necessity to evolve, so I think there is a necessity that needs to be addressed. So every country needs to see their own challenges and try to move forward. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of economic institutions, I believe it's perhaps the area where the countries are lagging more in comparison to other regions of the world. Now, Jamaica has made an important step in that direction. They have been implementing sound economic policies for several years now, and they have in place several institutions that provide some certainty for the future. So now they have a new way of implementing monetary policy in terms of inflation targeting. Now they have this idea of having an independent central bank in the future. So there is some law that has been drafted, needs still to be approved, but they are moving in the right direction. They also have some fiscal rules in place that have kind of give an idea to other agents how the government intends to behave. So regarding the level of debt for the future, for the following years, regarding the primary surplus, and so on and so forth. So when the government is committed to do something, and then you deliver, so that creates a lot of credibility. So allows you to build on that. Now, Barbados, for example, is in a situation now with a new IMF program and support from other multilaterals such as the IDB. The Caribbean Development Bank also is involved. I understand that the World Bank might also be involved. So there is an interesting opportunity for Barbados to move in a different direction. So if you take a look at some of the measures the government has already implemented and the ideas for the future, so they have this idea of fiscal rules also for the medium term. They have this idea of central bank independence and transparency also for the medium term. So that would provide some certainty to economic agents. Now, this is not a solution from one day to the next. So it's not that you can build credibility just because you say so. So credibility takes many, many years to be created and to be trusted. And unfortunately, you can lose that in a second.
That's true.
That decision, credibility is being lost from one day to the next, and then rebuilding it might be very difficult. So Barbados is in the process of rebuilding its credibility, and they are doing a terrific job, but it's still a long way to go. So new rules and regulations and laws need to be put in place. Then you need to see the government abiding by those regulations and rules. You need to see some changes the way economic policy is being done. So as long as you move in that direction and people realize that this is the new reality, the new norm, so investment, stability would follow. I mentioned in my previous intervention about Guyana, so they need to put in place a strong institutional framework that would deal in an appropriate way with the oil proceeds in the future. So that's something that the international community is kind of observing, and citizens in Guyana are also aware of that. So hopefully they will be able to put that in place. So as I mentioned, each country is different, and the book tries to focus a little bit more on that and to give specific recommendations on how we feel would put these economies on a more sustainable path in the medium term.
Okay, and Juan Pedro, Dieter, anything to add there?
No, I mean, as Moses mentioned, perhaps one of the commonalities that are strongly shown are the way to go in order to develop stronger economic institutions, right? And even though current institutions have been path dependent on colonial history, it doesn't mean that you cannot change them, right? And currently we do have evidence, right, of which institutions are more effective and how they should be organized. So we have the knowledge and the evidence that have been produced worldwide and that can serve and I think should be exploited towards introducing the set of institutions that are key for supporting a sustainable development path. Right?
And it's so important to refer to that knowledge, body of knowledge in the book too. So before we go to questions from the audience members who have logged into the webinar today, I just wanted to highlight something that I see as common to the Jamaica and the Barbados experience, and this rebuilding of credibility that you mentioned, Moises. And I think it has to do a lot with the level of communication that the authorities have with the people, how frequently they communicate, the matters that they communicate on, how often they engage. And I think that is something that I can see as being very different in Barbados and Jamaica now than previously, and also in compared to other countries right now. That level of communication and engagement is I think, a huge change that is going to continue to make a difference. And the second thing I would say, again, with Jamaica and Barbados, is the fact that you have, well, with Jamaica under the Economic Growth Council and the EPOC, collaborative approach where you have the public sector, private sector, NGOs, labor coming together and collaborating on a set of desired outcomes. And you've had that kind of tripartite approach in Barbados for a long time. And I feel like that's also important for the Caribbean to look at as a model. So more frequent communication, better communication, and also this collaborative approach between the various stakeholders, among the various stakeholders, I should say, in the community. So with that, I will turn now to Melissa to see if we have any questions pending.
Thank you, Marla. Thank you so much, gentlemen. The first thing I did want to highlight, a few people have asked about where they can access the book online, and we've created a short link, which is bit.ly, so it's bit.ly/institutionsbook, and that'll redirect you to the IDB's page where you can just put in your information and download the book. It's absolutely free. So please, again, that's bit.ly/institutionsbook. So you can go ahead and access the book online there. Now, getting into the questions, one of the themes that's coming up a lot is the theme of culture. So I'm going to kind of bring these questions together, and you gentlemen can go ahead and answer as you see fit. Institutions are made up of people. People operate in cultures. So what's the role of culture in determining the performance and effectiveness of our Caribbean institutions? And then how do we go about changing institutions when they're closely tied to our culture?
I just wanted to add something first before we also have the book in the handouts, right? That can be downloaded right here from the webinar panel. But
I'm sorry, that's right. Anyone that's on the live webinar will be able to download it from handouts. That's only available to the people that are on live, though.
Yes. But yeah, that's an interesting question about institutions and culture. And again, which one is the chicken and which one is the egg? I mean, behavior change is such an important but difficult part of evolving and growing. But yes, gentlemen, which one of you wants to handle this difficult question?
Maybe.
Well, I can.
I just want to. Yeah,
I'll start. So.
Okay.
So, at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, institutions can be formal, very formal, enshrined in laws and regulations and so on, or could also be informal. As long as people understand what you can expect from the other, I guess that's the relevant point. When you have a situation that is weak, you start from a weak position, perhaps you need to be more forceful in the way you establish institutions. So that is why, if you take a look at some history in Latin America, so there were very high levels of inflation, fiscal deficits were all over the place, crises all over the place. So governments in Latin America needed to send a very strong signal. That's why most of the rules are now enshrined in laws, specific laws, that really commit the government to do something. Now, if you are not in a situation that requires such a dramatic change in expectations, many countries have had kind of informal institutions. So you simply expect the other to react in a specific way. As long as there is some certainty and a clear understanding how people are going to react or how the government is going to react, so then you have the certainty to move forward. So if you are an investor and you want to go to one of these 6 countries and establish an industry, a firm, resort, whatever. So you want to have some certainty about the future. So that's basically the role of institutions. And of course, every country, every region has its own culture. But at the end of the day, I would say what people need is some certainty, some credibility, how the others is going to react. That's basically the bottom line of institutions, to have the rules of the game, how people are going to interact, that would frame their interactions, basically.
Tisa, Juan Pedro?
Yes, and as Moises mentioned, there are informal and formal institutions, right? And of course, institutions evolve from culture, from historical legacies, and it's very difficult to establish whether the institutions cause growth or whether growth also cause to have good institutions, so there's an endogeneity problem. What is true is that there's a lot of evidence of which particular institutions are strongly associated with better prospects for growth, right? And one example that we know, for example, fiscal rules and second condition fiscal rules and transparency and independence of central banks. Those are institutions that are mostly have mostly been implemented in particular in Latin America formally, as Moises mentions, in rules, in constitutions, etc. That we have now evidence that whether they work and how they work, right? So even though some cultural aspects might have shaped current institutions specifically for the Caribbean, the advantage that we have now is that we have evidence of what type of institutions have worked and what type of institutions have not worked, right? Evidence globally. So the idea is, okay, even though cultures might have affected how you have institutions currently, right? You can take advantage of this evidence that that is out there and kind of we have systematized in the book in order to think in establishing what has worked based on that evidence, right? Mm-hmm. And that is, let's say, free of cultural biases because it's hard evidence, right, of what has worked and what has not worked. And of course, if formal institutions are established, basically, the objective to establishing it formally is that the institution would transcend political cycles or a specific person, right? The idea is that the institutions, when they are really institutionalized, they go away specific leaderships or specific caudillism or specific political parties in power or specific people, right? The idea of formal institutions is that they transcend over time and over people, right?
Yes. I think if I want, I mean, sorry, Juan Pedro, was there anything you wanted?
No, I just want to mention, I think there's like a standard example against the culture, which is, for instance, if you speak about the Caribbean case, is all the millions of Caribbean who moved countries, go to a place like the US or Canada, the UK, and can be extremely successful. So I don't think there's a culture that kind of makes you be poor or break institutions. But of course, then there's a different environment. So maybe, let's say, Barbadian or Jamaican does business in the US, knows the legal framework, knows what can happen if, let's say, business doesn't work through. So what are they going to do? How much do they have to invest to protect themselves? And then if they're in another country that might have a weaker legal framework or it's more costly to enforce a contract, then they would react differently. So I think culture is very important, but at the end of the day, I also think we adjust ourselves exactly to the institutions where we're in.
I think I agree with you there. And actually, I once did a webinar with Terence Farrell, who wrote a book called The Underachieving Society, referring to Trinidad and Tobago, and then another one, We Like It So. And he spoke in that book, We Like It So, about the ambivalence and kind of split personalities that we have, where in a certain environment in Trinidad and Tobago, we behave a certain way, and you take us out and put us in London or in New York, and we behave a completely different way, and we adhere to the social and cultural norms, but also the laws that we were breaking in Trinidad. And so there is a role as well. I mean, yes, you take us out of one and put us in another, and we change and we adapt. So the role of the institution is very important. And with respect to institutions bringing about cultural change, when, for example, you ban plastics, or when, for example, you implement fiscal rules and rules around transparency and you enforce them, it drives changes in behavior, which eventually drive changes in culture. And so I see it all the time. And I hope that this drive that we have in the Caribbean around fiscal responsibility frameworks and fiscal transparency will engender a greater culture of transparency and responsibility, not just on a broad and fiscal scale, but even on a personal level in the Caribbean. That's one of the things I hope for. Perhaps we can take the next question.
I'll follow that same line of discussion, because we've gotten some questions specifically around fiscal responsibility and, for example, given the volatility of growth outcomes in the Caribbean and the high vulnerability to shocks, especially natural disasters, how should fiscal rules be framed to accommodate these realities?
Well, there is nothing one can do about geography and climate change and so on and so forth. So it's a reality that these countries face shocks. These countries are small and they are in the middle of the ocean at the mercy of weather conditions. So there is nothing one can do in that regard. So there are a lot of institutional developments like insurance schemes and so on, and the IDB has been working with these countries in order to develop that. So that's in case a significant event takes place. Mm-hmm. Now, what we have in mind, as I mentioned before, is prepare for the future. Be as resilient as possible. Now, of course, if you have a hurricane that devastates half of a country, there is not much one can do. That's certainly the case. And then you need to rely on other types of schemes like insurance and donors and help from other organizations. That's a given, unfortunately. There is nothing one can do. But at the end of the day, you can have a country in a better shape, being more resilient to shocks, not only climatic, but also economic shocks. So the Caribbean is very much dependent, let's say, tourism, what happens in the UK, what happens in the US, trade, and so on and so forth. So once you have institutions that set clearer understanding of how the government is going to behave, so that makes a more resilient economy. Now, if you get a terrible shock, so it's difficult to address the shock. But if you have a clearer understanding how fiscal policy is going to be implemented, if you have some resources allocated for, let's say, a hurricane, if you have some savings for the future, if you have some escape clauses, because at the end of the day, these rules are good for a particular moment in time, but you don't know what's going to happen in the medium term. So all these rules, if one takes a look at the literature, you have some escape clauses. So if there is a shock that was not expected, so you can deviate from the rule. As long as there is a commitment, there is a strategy, how you are going to come back. So let's say there is a hurricane, and then the government needs to spend significantly more in order to address the difficult situation of a hurricane, let's say. So there is an understanding that you are going to deviate from your objective in terms of fiscal policy. So perhaps you are going to have a larger deficit, or you are going to have a higher debt than what you anticipated because you need to get resources in order to address a difficult situation. But if the rule establishes a strategy, 5 years from now, 3 years from now, I'm going back to where I was headed to, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. So people understand events happen and unanticipated situations to appear, but there is a strategy how the government intends to come back to the target. So that's basically how fiscal rules evolve. So these are not really straight jackets that simply tie your hands and leave and gives no possibility of deviating. Now, the idea is to tie your hands for expenditures that are not desirable. So if you are in the midst of a political campaign, or you don't want the ruling party to start spending, so you have a rule that specifically puts a limit to that and avoids such a cycle. But if you have a climatic event that no one anticipated, or even if you anticipated, it's difficult really to face a situation of that sort. So there are possibilities of deviating without losing the trust of economic agents that you are implementing a sound fiscal policy. So at the end of the day, what we want to have is more clarity and more certainty and a commitment that fiscal mismanagement won't take place. That's basically the idea of rules.
Exactly. And so, notwithstanding a hurricane clause, that level of transparency and responsibility needs to be maintained once we get back on our feet. And I agree with that. Can we take the next question, Melissa?
Yes. Institutions should not be decisions frozen in time. They have to change as society change. How have the Caribbean regional institutions changed since their founding? And what would you say are the keys or the quick wins on improving institutions in this region right now?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I've taken so many, so Juan Pedro has been quite silent, so I'll defer this to you, JP.
Thank you. I mean, maybe I can talk about, I don't know whether it's a quick win, but just mention a bit but you also, I know, Marla, you are interested in the Jamaican experience. But I'm saying I'm not sure whether it's a quick win because that process basically started in 2010. Was as far as I remember, the first responsibility law. It went through the legally binding fiscal rule, a lot of changes, and I think this is where probably a lot can be done. And as Moses has mentioned before, and I'm not even sure, I would have even put it stronger. If you're in the small island in the Caribbean or a country facing the Caribbean, then you need to have strong fiscal institutions because it's more likely that you're going to be hit by a hurricane or a storm. And the institution is a bit like a roof. You're only going to know whether it's good once you get a real heavy rain or once you get a shock. So
that's a good point.
I think so. Anything that is on the fiscal part, exactly this, because if you look at the region, basically all the countries are either in the middle of a fiscal consolidation or kind of starting it. So all of them have a bit of a fiscal challenge. The debt levels are not equally high everywhere, but at the end of the day, they're probably a bit higher than they would want them to be, or at least they're higher than in 2007. So I think fiscal is very important. And also once the fiscal house is in order, there's much more you can do in everything else. The monetary was also mentioned by Moses, also something very important. Again, is something how independent your central bank is, how transparent it is. Again, this is more important when you're under stress than when everything is normal. So it's probably a good time now also with a relatively good international environment to start looking at those issues and start improving them, strengthening them, just in case a few years down the road there's more stress in the system. So I would say those two.
I would want to add, though, that I am told, I mean, I'm not a legal professional, but I'm told by, judges and lawyers and so on that, in countries where we perceive, for example, corruption to be high, Trinidad and Guyana, it's not for a lack of good laws. It's for a lack of enforcement. And I would say that perhaps a quick win, maybe it's not that quick, but I think something that we need to emphasize in certain countries in the Caribbean is enforcement. Not that the laws themselves are not relevant or not the right laws or not structured well, but that there is inadequate enforcement. And so, I mean, it may not be a quick win. It's a complex problem, but I feel sometimes that if we would just focus on and emphasize enforcement, it would make a big difference.
Well, that's certainly the case. And if you have a law that on paper is very good, but nobody pays attention to that, and enforcement is not good, so
exactly. So why even from a fiscal, so even fiscal responsibility frameworks and fiscal rules why would you want to layer that on top of a system that already lacks proper enforcement? You know, to me, you need to fix the enforcement part before you can think about implementing these new frameworks and laws.
Oh, the idea is to have kind of a new departing point, so a new departure point. So you say, from now on, I have a new law, and there's going to be enforcement, and then there is a commitment to abide by the law and to show results and to be transparent about it, and so on and so forth. So when you talk about central bank transparency, it's not just a concept. So you have central banks distributing information, governors of central banks being very open, very transparent about central bank interventions in the exchange market, in the monetary market, and so on and so forth. You produce information the day you were supposed to produce it. So I have a fixed date for the release of the fiscal numbers. I have a fixed date for the release of the monetary aggregates, and so on and so forth. And regardless of the numbers, whether good or bad, so you are accountable and you respond to those fixed dates. So enforcement certainly has a lot to do. So it's not just changing a regulation, changing a law, amending a law. At the end of the day, you have to deliver. That is why it takes, as I mentioned before, a long time to build credibility. So the laws and regulations simply establish a framework. But if you don't pay attention to the framework, so the laws might be useless. So
Exactly.
enforcement is certainly part of the equation. You have to have laws, you have to have regulations, and then you have to comply by them.
Indeed.
Correct.
So perhaps we can have one more question, Melissa, given the time that we have.
Yeah, and I think that the topic of corruption keeps coming up in the questions, and so is there a basic policy or basic set of policies, and obviously the enforcement piece that you just touched on is extremely important, but what would you say are these basic policies that just have to be adopted in order to create greater transparency and establish trust in institutions?
That's a good question. I see everybody looking like they're
You're all looking at Peter.
Yeah, you're looking at Peter. You'll take this one.
Can you repeat again the question, please?
Yes. What would you say are the basic set of policies that have to be adopted to create transparency and establish trust in institutions?
Yeah, I mean, we have so the book includes a chapter specifically focusing on trust and perceptions of the people on the different institutions that we analyze. Okay, so how is trust in institutions built over time? Is a long-term process. Okay, so for example, if we put the example of fiscal transparency and fiscal rules and monetary policy transparency. When first these institutions were established in Latin America, for example, there was a crisis of trust. So nobody trusts the central bank, if they say, okay, we're going to keep inflation in this range, right? At the beginning, nobody trusts them, right? But once you start complying with what you announce, then trust starts to build on, right? So I think to gain trust in a particular institution, there has to be a continuous and sustainable compliance with what you are announcing, right? It's not something that's going to appear from one day to the other, as also Moises was mentioning. As I was mentioning before, what type of institutions to implement is not a mystery. So we already have evidence of what should be implemented and what is more urgent than other things to be done, right? And in particular, if we speak about the case of the Caribbean, economic institutions, in terms of fiscal and monetary side, is obvious that need some further development and implementation. But whether people are going to start trusting these institutions at the onset, that's not the case, right? Trust is going to be built if and only if these institutions are sustainable and are compliant with what they announce over time, right? And that's the key ingredient, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that this discussion is in chapter 7 of the book. And you're right, this is one of the chapters that I did manage to get through in the book, and it's really telling. So perhaps we can have one more question, Melissa.
Marla, I think that we can probably go ahead and give final comments because everything else I think we pretty much covered.
Oh, okay. So, all right, and I will give each of you an opportunity to give me your closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think this is I would say this is a book for the future. So it's not that you implement the recommendations that we have from one day to the next. So it's kind of a roadmap for a medium-term strategy where we analyze different institutions for different countries. It's the final decision of citizens and policymakers in each of these countries how to move ahead. We simply highlight some of the issues that we consider relevant, given the international evidence that it's available for everyone to see. So we simply compare these countries in the Caribbean to other regions in the world that have made some progress in order to increase the prospects for growth, employment, and diminish poverty levels. So, as I mentioned before, each country is different. Some sets of institutions might be more developed in one country as opposed to another. So it's basically for society to decide how to move forward. So at the end of the day, we have a set of indicators, a set of recommendations, and we produce this book because we believe it has interesting ideas, it has kind of a strategy for the future, but it's not so easy to implement. So you are dealing with issues as the last question about corruption, how you get rid of corruption and trust, and how you increase trust, and it's not only having the proper legal environment and the rules and so on, you have to enforce them. So it's a strategy. We are simply pointing out to some issues that we consider relevant for these countries to give an important leap forward. And hopefully this would stimulate some debate and would create some ideas for the future that people in every country, together with policymakers, can agree on and move forward. That's basically the objective of the book. It's not to say tomorrow you have to do X, Y, and Z and you are going to be in a better situation. And you have unforeseen events, and you have natural disasters, and you have so many intricacies and complications along the way. But what we wanted to do is simply give a set of recommendations that people should take, should consider for the Caribbean to be in a better shape in the years to come.
Thank you, Moises.
Yeah, I could agree more. What I was going to mention is that this book should be seen as a policy agenda for the medium and long term, but based on evidence, right? So all recommendations that are given in the book for each country, and also some topics that cover regionally, are based on sound and systematized evidence. Nothing is just there in the air. So that's the work that we have been doing to provide a roadmap, as Moses mentioned, based on the best available up-to-date evidence on the effectiveness of certain institutions for a better future for our countries in the Caribbean. So this is how it's to be seen, and we plan to continue doing more fine-tuning, applied research and roadmaps for specific implementation or specific type of institutions in hopefully next publication.
Thank you. Thanks, Dita. Juan Pedro?
So now I'm at the end, and this is of course getting harder to say something. Instead of saying something myself, I'm going to cite James Robinson, who is a professor, and he gave a comment on the book, which you can also find in the book. And I think it kind of reflects nicely what the book was trying to do. And I'm going to shorten it. I'm just going to say what is relevant here. The Caribbean has been a crucible for every institutional experiment of the modern world, from plantation slavery and globalization to building states and democracy.
Yeah.
And it goes on, and then it says that there's so much we can learn from a rich set of natural experiments. And I like this because it's exactly what we tried to do. It's show all the experiences that were there, how different they were. They led the countries to a different place. Countries have been moving at a different speed and have done different things. So we really hope that you enjoy the book, and hopefully we can also make a difference to the Caribbean.
Thank you, Juan Pedro. And yes, I did really like that quote. And I wanted then read what the current Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados said. She said, institutions, and then of course this is also from your book, institutions in the Caribbean have played a critical role in being able to enhance our democracy and to provide a platform for economic growth. They have protected the interests of those least capable of protecting themselves. It is vital that we work each day to ensure that our institutions continue to play this role without themselves becoming obsessively distracted with their own sustainability at the expense of achieving their core mission. And I think she's speaking about the evolution of institutions here and the relevance and making sure that institutions are relevant and fit for purpose. And that's a very important comment. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on this webinar today. Thanks again to the IDB for partnering. And like you, I hope that this book makes a difference in the policies that we adopt in the Caribbean going forward, evidence-based policy making, enforcement of these policies and laws, and all for the goal of a better living standards and outcomes for all of us in the Caribbean. Thank you so much for your contribution.